All right, here's the plan on how we're going to get the explosion juice from the tank into the up and downers to make it go round and rounders at the right volume, at the right pressure. So pretty simplistic, not to scale, but we'll walk through it really quickly. Starting out with the tank, pretty easy here. We got the vent just to allow the pressure to equalize in the tank. Because of the setup of this system, I don't need a special tank. This is just the original tank that I'm going to use. I'll show you that in a second. But I don't need a special tank because I don't need the baffles and I won't need a sump or any sort of anything in there. Even though I'm doing EFI, because of this header tank setup that I'm using. So really this is just the original carbureted tank with a pickup just sitting at the bottom. And I'll be pulling fuel out through, first of all, through this basic old like carbureted paper filter. So it'll come through here and it'll go to what is essentially a carbureted system pump, a low pressure pump. And all its job is to pick the fuel up out of the bottom of this tank and deposit it into this header tank. Now, as I said, it's not to scale. So this tank is 15, 14 gallons on the Camaro. This header tank is actually only half a gallon, a little bit more than half a gallon, and it's relatively tall. The high pressure pump, the one that's actually going to regulate the pressure and bring that pressure up and supply it to the engine, is submerged in fuel in this tank at almost all times, because you've got this pump always trying to keep this tank full. Having the pump submerged is good for two reasons. One is that it keeps it cool, so it extends the life of the pump. Two is that because it's submerged in this sort of small but tall tank, you're never going to get the pickup, which is at the bottom, uncovered. So this tank, high braking or acceleration or going around a turn, this tank will become uncovered periodically, but it'll always be able to pick up that fuel and put it in here. And unless you're doing a skid pad for, minutes at a time, this tank will always have fuel in it. The other nice thing about this setup is that the pressure regulator sits at the top of this tank. And so you only have to have a return line back from this tank. So as you can see here, I've got my fuel coming in, the pump's in there. There's a fuel pressure regulator here. The one I've got is pressure reference. So if you wanted to do a boost setup where you raise the fuel pressure, you can. I won't be. And then it just dumps its excess fuel back into the tank. And then the fuel that it does use is going to come out through this 10 micron filter to get it very clean so they don't plug up any of the injectors. And it's going to enter one of the fuel rails and get crossed over and enter the other fuel rail. And the cool thing is you don't have a return from the fuel rail because you already regulated everything here. So it cleans up the engine bay a little bit. And because I don't have to run a return, I don't need to run a fuel pressure regulator here. This is just a fuel pressure sensor, which will be nice because it gives you the true fuel pressure right here. So a lot of good reasons to run this setup. Hopefully once I get it out and get it tested, I'll have good things to say and it'll be real nice. Here's the original stock tank. Like I said, when you run this kind of a setup, you don't really need anything special or anything baffled or anything like that. And there's no baffles in here. So just gonna run the original tank for now. I've got a cheap 20-gallon fuel cell I may throw in the trunk, but I wanna make sure to close off the back bulkhead and everything before I do that. So I'm just gonna run this for the time being. I wasn't exactly sure what all these different lines did, so I just threw a bore scope in there. So for those of you watching at home who care and are interested, the main pickup is right here. This little circular piece goes right there. This is the pickup as well as the float level valve. So there's a little float arm with a little potentiometer. There's the pickup with a little sock on it. And then over here, you have two. This one on this side is a return, so it just comes straight in and there's a pipe that goes along the top of this tank, and it actually is welded to this little embossment right there, and it just dumps straight in. So you can use that as a return. This one right next to it is actually a vent. Its pipe comes in and goes diagonal all the way across, and then it comes up and stops right up in here, which is the highest point in the tank, so that's how you know it's a vent. And then this one over here is actually just another, looks like a return. I'm not exactly sure why there are two that are identical, but it's a return. So it comes in and it's welded right there. So I'm gonna cap one of these returns off, use one of the returns to come back from the header tank. I'll use the vent just as a vent, and I'll use the original pickup as a pickup. And hopefully everything should work just fine. Here's some of the other components that I talked about in the flesh. This is just a cheap, like $10 low pressure fuel filter. Here's the low pressure pump. It's just a standard old Carter. I think it's a 6 to 8 PSI, 72 gallons per hour pump. It's not the lightest thing, but it's relatively cheap. They're easy to find. Really, you could do this job with almost anything. So I just needed something with a decent flow rate. It was relatively reliable. This is the real, make it happener here. It's quite the piece. It looks really nice. I got the one from FiTech, but there are certainly ones from other manufacturers and sources. This was reasonably priced for what it is. It's got a 340 liter per hour pump inside here, which should be plenty for my target 600, maybe a little couple, 3 here more. Horsepower, normally aspirated. It's got the outlet to the engine, the inlet, and then the return. And then it's got a little fuel pressure gauge here. Here's the fuel pressure regulator. I forget what it's set to. It may be 60 PSI or like 58 PSI relative to atmosphere. If you ran boost, you could run a boost reference port right here. So it's set up for that, but I won't be using that. And then it's just got the 2 connections for the pump. It's really simple. It should work really well. And then it's got this little 10 micron filter going on here. So we're gonna start installing the stuff on the car so we can run the lines. Oh, one other thing that is really nice about running this setup is that because everything's low pressure up to here, you don't need any special line. You can use just regular old fuel line because the pressure's low. You don't need anything that can handle high pressures until you get to here. And in my case, I'm mounting this under the hood. So that's kind of nice, save you a few bucks. Tank's all hung. Like I said, it's the stock tank, so it just kind of went up there with some fiddling. Used a couple of bungee cords from the pan hard rod around to the bumper, held it up real nice. I mounted the pump here. There's sort of a 45-degree kick up at the front edge of the trunk, and so I just mounted it right there. There was just enough room. I could slide it just high enough to stay below this cross member for the rear suspension, and just so that it misses the tank with these power connectors. And it's at a 45. I honestly don't think it's going to matter that much if it's not perfectly vertical. I just don't have the room to go vertical. And then the fuel filters here, I just wrapped a couple of rounds of electrical tape and put a slice of fuel hose on this tube right here and band clamped it on. The intent is eventually to take this out and put the fuel cell inside. And so I didn't really feel like punching holes and making brackets and things like that because I wasn't exactly sure if this is where this is going, but this is probably where this is going to stay. So the fuel is going to come out of here. It actually comes from the top of the tank down this line, which is all stock. And then I'll run a hose here, back into here, and then just loop it around. And that's the inlet and the outlet, and then the hose is going to come back kind of up over and then down to the front. So we'll go ahead and run the hose now. Stuff that I used. I said this is just standard old 3/8 IED fuel line. And then I use these Adel clamps. They're a little more expensive than zip ties, but they sure can sing. They also do a good job of holding things in place a lot better than just zip tying it. And they look a lot better too. It looks more professional. And then I pretty much just use rivnuts everywhere with these bolts to kind of work my way down to try to get the line really well supported. In areas that it might be touching the body or something like that, I use this nylon woven split loom tubing, which is a lot nicer than that gutter pipe looking stuff you get from the AutoZone. And then I just use some loom tape, which I had gotten this stuff to make the wiring harness look a lot nicer, but it actually should do really good at preventing chafing on the fuel lines. I did get some fire sleeve because I thought I was going to run it right by the exhaust, but it turned out not to, so I'll be using this for some other stuff, some clutch lines or whatnot. So come over here and I'll show you what I've got going on under the car. So as I kind of showed you before, I got the vent coming out. To start with that, it kind of comes up and over and then dumps out right here. This is just kind of temporary till I get the other one. I'll have to do a different vent when I go to the fuel cell. But it comes out of the pipe from the pickup, circles around and heads into this fuel filter, and then around into the low pressure pump. It goes up above the cross member, the extreme cross member, and then comes down. You can see where I've got both return lines and the feed line together, and I use the same bolt if I can in some locations. I have it running down here kind of far enough away from the exhaust. Here's an example of where I use the split loom tubing because it might rub up against here where I have to cross under this frame rail. So I use some of that split loom and some of the loom tape, and then it runs on down here. Same thing here, right where the original line went. Now this isn't a hard line, but that's why I'm using so many Adel clamps, to try to keep them hanging up tight against the bottom right there. And then I was thinking I was gonna go on top of the frame, and then go up here, because where the original fuel line went, it was right here. And I had put rivnuts in there in preparation for that. But when I realized I really wasn't going over here, I'm going to my header tank. So I just decided to, pardon the matrix action going on here, decided to bring it straight up here, and then around, and then up to the header tank right here. So you got the supply line coming in here. I said it wrong on the other one. The right one is the supply line, the left one is the return. Comes in, gets regulated. I haven't got the deadhead pump going up, but here's, you can see my filter, and it's gonna come over here, and it's regulated back down and goes all the way back before it gets in the other side. So I think it looks pretty tidy. Everything's really sturdy, especially those clamps. I think it'll hold it in place really nice. Here's a little bonus content. I think with all the things that I'm finding on this car, I need to start a separate series called What Were They Thinking? This is the end of the hard line coming out of the tank where you would do the pickup of the fuel. And as I was getting ready to slip the hose over this end, I kind of looked at it and I went, huh, what the heck? And there's a hole in it. And I checked it, and yeah, and indeed it is a hole. I thought originally that I had made it, maybe when I was taking the tank out, but you can see that the cut surface here is pretty grungy and crudded up, so it's definitely been a hole there for a while. You can also see that the original hose only went down to here, so this hole has been open to atmosphere for quite a long time, and the fuel pump, I guess, was just powerful enough that it was able to also suck air in here, but it was also sucking enough fuel to keep the car running. So I have to wonder if maybe things were running a little lean, or if the bowls weren't being completely filled because of this problem. So, you know, who knows how long that's been happening. So I'm glad I found that, because that probably would have given me fits if I was trying to get the fuel injection system started and it just wasn't, you know, sufficiently filling the header tank. So anyways, it's always amazing what you find.